Well, welcome to our mediation launch event, Mediation Now Tools for Tricky Times. I'm Heather Rogers and I'm chairing the event this evening, and I'm a barrister and mediator. Thanks to those who've come into the room for coming out on a cold night at all and braving the traffic. We know that some people are held up, but the people who just come in, I think we thought we'd better start. And you may be able to tell that we've also got a Zoom attendance tonight, so there are people who are attending remotely, so thank you for them coming as well. If you're in the room, of course, you're getting a free Doughty Street pen, which you won't get online. And you've also got a flyer on your seat, which has got some upcoming Doughty Street events, which you're very welcome to sign up to. If you're online, then you can see the details of the upcoming events on the Doughty Street website, so you're not so deprived. Why did we decide to have this event? Well, it came out of conversations that we were having within chambers. Obviously, these are very tricky times on all sorts of fronts, and in the litigation context in particular, there's a lot of challenges. And we were having a lot of discussions, and it came about that we learned that a lot of people actually in our group were mediating to a greater or lesser extent. And we came together to have conversations about mediation, sharing our experiences. We've done some in-house training, which has been very useful, shared, having sort of that kind of debate that you can have. And there are a lot of issues that we thought were of interest, and some of those we're going to be talking about tonight. But we were looking at what are the barriers to mediation. I mean, sometimes when working as a litigator, you think it's a very, very strange way of trying to resolve disputes. It can be very costly, very stressful, of course, very expensive. And mediation as a way of resolving disputes seems to be so sensible by contrast. It's so constructive in terms of focusing on the outcome rather than on the problems, getting people out of situations rather than locking them in. But there are lots of things. So the debates that we were having, we thought we wanted to share and roll out the debate. We have put together a video which is available on the website, just about us and our team. And this conversation, partly to introduce us and to just, as I say, to roll out the debate. And thanks for those who participated in a poll that we ran online in the run-up to this event. It was quite interesting to see. We asked, why do people avoid mediation? What are the biggest barriers to advising clients to mediate? And in reverse order, the top three were, in bronze medal position, proposing mediation looks weak. The silver medal was costs of mediation, slightly surprising compared to other costs. But the gold medal winner was that the parties are too entrenched. And that's seen as one of the big barriers to mediation. So it's that kind of, what are people's experiences on the ground as a mediator, as a party, that we hope to take forwards. So the plan for this evening is we're going to have speakers. As you see, we've got quite a big panel. There are 5 people. We're conscious this is going to be a bit of a taster because people are on very strict time limits. And so that's actually so that we can have Q&A at the end, because we do want to have debates, but we'll save questions till the end. If you're online, you can put questions into the chat. If you're here, you can either wait and have a mic at the end, or even perhaps write something on a piece of paper and hand it up, in a bit old tech. But this is the order that we're going to be going in. Althea, who's on at the end, is going to speak first about encouraging clients to engage in mediation and paths to success. And then Sophie is going to speak about developing mediation in medical cases. Amelia is going to talk about the proposals that they're making mediation mandatory and seeing what that's going to mean. Louisa is speaking about mediation in the workplace. And then, with the smallest topic of all, Lawrence is going to speak about mediating as a tool to tackle the climate crisis, with an ambitiously subtitle talk, Can Environmental Mediation Save the Planet? So there are lots of sort of cross-topic areas and also some specific areas that we're all going to cover. Oh, there's one thing I should say, I suppose I would say this at the beginning rather than before it gets too late, is that this is, there are no fire drills expected tonight. So if we hear a fire bell. It will be real. We hope it won't happen, but our fire marshal is Ray, who's over there. If we hear a fire alarm, she'll lead us out to the fire assembly point and make sure that we're all safe. So we'll need to make our way out of the building. But with that safety reminder, I'll hand over without further ado to Althea, who's going to talk about encouraging people to mediate.
Marvellous. Good evening to you all, and thank you so very much for coming. I'm going to click my first. There we are. I don't think that very many of us would disagree with the sentiment that's expressed by Lord Philip of Worth Travers. And I suspect that many of us on this panel and many of us in this room today have come to mediation through litigation. Either directly or indirectly, we will have seen the financial and emotional harm caused when parties expend time, money, and energy in protracted litigation. The reality, as we know, is that most outcomes achievable in litigation can be secured more economically through negotiation and agreement. And the scope to achieve beyond what is possible through litigation merits a seminar topic on its own, in my view. The benefits and advantages are as broad and as wide as can be imagined in any context. And yet, despite all of this, we know that perfectly sensible, rational, even hard-nosed and commercially astute individuals find themselves submerged and entrenched in what are often bitter, resource wasting disputes. The answer lies in ourselves, and recognizing or accepting the truth that the driver that conflict plays in all our lives, the drive to win, sometimes rashly and at all costs. It is necessary to acknowledge the significance of conflict, and then we can begin to work with it. So, a positive take on conflict. Conflict can prove necessary in effecting meaningful and needed change. And there is a reference to Hegel, an 18th century philosopher, who talked about the cycle of thesis. So thesis, which is the status quo, antithesis, which is a challenge to the status quo, and then synthesis, which is the reconciliation of those two, and resolution. So let's have a look at psychology in mediation, because it's all about people. And what tools does mediation offer? The first step is to recognize that there are 4 psychological elements that drive conflict: our emotions, our self-esteem, our values, and our perceptions. And it's these very human traits that frequently create barriers to negotiation and to mediation. Emotions, first of all. All disputes have a common thread. One party is demanding something, and the other party is unwilling to give it. Almost invariably, the demand will include a commercial element to it and an emotional element. And similarly, the refusal to give in, the refusal to cooperate. And so, as to which is the more powerful dynamic, you might agree with me that if every dispute was approached on the basis of a purely commercial view or basis, disputes would be resolved sooner and more easily. But we have a dispute, and quite often in those disputes, there are allegations. There are allegations of fault, which is highly emotive and inevitably involves considerable injury to feelings. To allege a breach of an agreement or an act of negligence creates deep feelings of hurt. And when that hurt is denied or disputed, it can result in greater insult, irritation, and upset. So the first principle with which the psychologically informed mediation participant must engage is that when parties are in conflict, they struggle to think or behave rationally because they are also being driven by their emotions. The added problem is that we will all struggle with recognizing the impact and the influence on our decision-making of those underlying emotions. We are utterly convinced that our demands and or our resistance to agreeing to demands being made of us is entirely logical. Whereas, quite often, the underlying demand is driven by anger, hurt, or a desire to punish. That's why, as mediators and lawyers advising clients, and indeed as parties to mediation, it is essential to understand the force and the influence that emotions exert that can overwhelm logic, rationale, or legalistic arguments. We have heard and had those conversations, I just can't get through. It doesn't matter how many times I explain it, it's just not being heard. And the greater and more intense the emotion, the scarcer the logic. There is an anatomical and neurological explanation as well, the amygdala. This is the part of the brain which governs our instinctive fight or flight responses. As elegantly phrased, the amygdala prevents paralysis through analysis. So in a fight or flight situation, what is demanded is an immediate and urgent response rather than careful analytical reasoning. And so it is this hijacking of the rational mind that so frequently occurs in the highly emotional state that you have in a bitter dispute, where there are allegations of fault or harm or neglect that in turn creates an emotional barrier to settlement. It is difficult to think rationally when we're upset. Another human trait to be reckoned with powerfully is that we all have self-esteem. We all harbour a need to think well of ourselves and to be thought well of by others. The problem is that self-esteem is not static. It can go up as well as down. And consequently, we expend considerable time, effort, and energy in maintaining and protecting our self-worth and in seeking the approval of others. And this is a dynamic that also plays out strongly in the mediation process. There can be little more damaging to self-esteem than to be on the receiving end of allegations of fault or negligence or criminal or even dishonest conduct. And again, hearing the denials when those allegations are made. And so, accusations of failure, a failure to act in a way that all other reasonable people would, or accusations of failure to abide by an agreement may well be perceived as nothing short of betrayal. And this may no less keenly be felt when the allegation is made against a corporate body. So, for example, a board of trustees, a board of governors of a school. In any of these scenarios, the need to secure a good outcome is also related to the sense of self-esteem. And the conduct of parties may be governed by the desire for approval, to maintain self-esteem, to protect against manipulation, exploitation, or even humiliation. And this in turn leads to certain behaviours in the mediation room. So what we will have is parties casting themselves as the good guys and the opposition as the bad guys. Neither party willing to go first in making proposals for fear of getting it wrong or pitching too high or pitching too low. Parties wanting to keep their cards close to their chest for fear that disclosure will be used against them for manipulation or exploitation. Having the last word, the need to be seen as having won. It is important to recognise and address these behaviours in a non-judgmental, understanding and empathetic way, seen as one element of a suite of emotional and psychological responses that influence our decision-making. Another important aspect of self-esteem is the need to be heard. Being heard translates into being valued, appreciated, and understood. And many disputes are the result of parties feeling undervalued, ignored, misunderstood, or misrepresented. And so it's essential in mediation that space is made. Investing time in active listening demonstrates not only that one has been heard, understood, and that what has been said has been accepted and acknowledged, even if not agreed with, and that's important too. It's for these reasons that active listening, reflecting back, paraphrasing, and summarizing are essential tools in mediation for the path to success. Next, I want to talk about values. Our values are linked to our self-esteem. For when our values, and in particular those we hold most dear, are challenged or abused, we find our self-esteem under attack and we become angered and in conflict. But we have different values and different value systems, and so we must be alert to the fact that we may not always share the same values or feel as strongly as others may feel where those values have been compromised. So, for example, being on time or even always early may be very important to one person and very much less so to another. We must respect the fact that our values differ. Of course, values can also become sedimented, rigid, resistant to rationalization. Any transgression, even minor, can be viewed very seriously, whilst on the other side of the dispute, there is little appreciation of the strength of feeling involved, leading to minimizing the feelings of the other. And so, what's the path? What's the tools that we have to deal with these situations? Well, the mediator's toolbox involves encouraging the parties to focus on the values which they share. You get a beneficial impact upon parties holding entrenched positions. So, for example, directors of a business engaged in a bitter disagreement can agree that both have been committed to the business's success and survival, but disagree on how to achieve and why. Divorced parents agree that it is important to safeguard the emotional and financial well-being of their children, rather than focus on the sadness and betrayal that caused the relationship breakdown. The trick is to focus on understanding what are the respective value systems that are feeding into the discussions around settlement, how sedimented and whether there is room for change or respectful agreement to differ, whilst finding a way through based on what values are shared. Finally, perception. Misperceptions are assumptions we all make about the people we meet, their appearance, their intellect, their behavior, and their motivations. Invariably, these assumptions are incorrect, but when allowed to fester, become fixed as established facts. Many disputes are founded on an assumption about the conduct or motivations of another. One party will assume that they know exactly why the other person did or said something, or why they conducted themselves in a particular manner. And sadly, the more tenuous the relationship, the less likely that one will give the other the benefit of the doubt. This in turn leads to a descent into conflict, harboring grudges based on assumptions created historically and reinforced over time, maybe years. So why X wasn't invited to Y's wedding and then not encouraged to apply for promotion? Or whether J really was the best person for the job, or in fact was the yes person that invariably supported D's back. Often these assumptions may be very far from the truth, but are no less deeply felt and believed. The key to it is to facilitate a conversation where there can be an open discussion around how and why these conversations are held, and where there are misconceptions seeking to dispel them. Be willing to have difficult conversations. Ultimately, mediation is a profoundly human experience. It's always about people and the various humanizing and yet challenging human traits that drive human interactions. The essential tool, the essential path to success is to embrace the reality that we all come to the table with our biases and foibles and misperceptions. And if we can do that, that will provide the room to start to communicate in a meaningful, constructive and respectful way. Thank you.
Thank you, Althea, and welcome everyone from me. My name's Sophie Miles. I'm a mediator and barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, and I'm also a member of the Court of Protection and Mental Health team. And I'm going to talk a little bit about mediation and conflict resolution and conflict reduction generally in medical cases. I've got a little bit to say about the context, if the clicker works. It doesn't. It does work, great. I've then got a bit to say about the challenges, not just in mediation, but in trying to reduce the level of conflict arising generally. And then I'm looking at some of the tools that may improve matters. So starting with the context one, great. What the kind of cases that I'm going to talk about are differences about serious medical treatment, either for children or for adults who lack the capacity to consent to that treatment. And these are cases which tend to emerge either in the Court of Protection or, in the case of children, in the family division. And in some cases, there are effectively 2 points of view. There's a point of view of the health body, a doctor that wants to deliver treatment. And then there's a point of view of a patient who is refusing that treatment and maintaining their capacity to do so. The health body may say the patient doesn't have capacity, but the treatment is in their best interest. So those are the cases where there are really 2 viewpoints, health provider and the person who may or may not have capacity to consent to their treatment. And those cases perhaps are less likely, it seems to me, to be susceptible to resolution through mediation. But perhaps the cases where mediation may have more of a part to play are those where there are 3 points of view. Again, the health body, a doctor that either wants to deliver treatment or believes that it's not in the best interest for treatment to continue and that it therefore should be withdrawn. Again, the patient, a child or a person, adult lacking capacity, and family members as well. Parents, devastated parents who found out their child has a life-threatening illness, or other family members facing that decision. So in many such cases, in many such situations, what takes place is a process of shared decision-making, which may well lead to an agreed course of action, even if that agreed course of action leads to the end of the life of the patient concerned. But there are also examples of very protracted and often quite distressing litigation. There are some high-profile examples that I've put on the screen, the Charlie Gard case, and then a little bit later, the case of the seriously ill toddler Alfie Evans. And then there are other cases that are not so high-profile, but are just as distressing nonetheless. And some cases will always require a resolution by a judge. But what can mediation do, and what are the challenges for the mediator in this particular type of scenario? So the challenges very much go with the territory. In serious medical cases, you may well be working with a family who are facing an unimaginable trauma, being told out of the blue that their loved one has a life-threatening illness and a decision needs to be made very, very quickly about what, if any, treatment they're going to receive. And it's readily understandable that in that situation, there may be a real sense of power imbalance. What can parents do when they're being told by a group of clinicians that they know what the answers are? To what extent can families even participate in mediation in these cases? Legal aid is available to families in court of protection cases and also in cases being brought in the family division about medical treatment. It's means tested, and there's a relatively small pool of practitioners able to take those cases on. How do you involve the interests of the patient themselves, the child, an adult who may lack capacity, who may be unconscious, in a coma? How are they going to be involved, and how is the mediator going to involve sort of triangulating between the health body and the family? And what happens when there are third-party supporters and advisors who bring their own point of view to the table? And perhaps more fundamentally, how often is it even taking place? Anecdotal evidence suggests that mediation in serious medical treatment cases is in fact relatively rare. There was a report examining mediation in court of protection cases, and none of the cases examined in that report were medical cases. I'm now going to look at broader challenges across the board. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a briefing note produced by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. And this looks specifically at disagreements in the care of critically ill children. And it's very well worth looking at. And the briefing note asked the question of why do disagreements arise? And they identified a number of factors, and I've put some of them up on the slide: poor communication, differing perspectives, feelings of powerlessness. And they identified that there might be feelings of powerlessness, not just simply in the family, but also amongst health professionals who are attempting to help a seriously ill patient. And very importantly, delays in seeking help to resolve differences, so that by the time mediation or other resolution is being considered, the parties have become quite entrenched, and it's much harder to start finding the common ground and having the constructive discussions that Althea has just talked about. And another feature that the briefing note identified is our general wish to avoid the subject of death, to put off some of the difficult conversations that have to be had in these circumstances. Recommendations from the briefing notes fell in the remit of policy, recommendations to providers of health services, and also about research. So in relation to policy, there was a recommendation that there should be more development about conflict management frameworks, increasing access to resolution, and that there should be gathering of data on how effective that is. A further recommendation was about increasing training on ethics and conflict management for paediatric healthcare staff. And I just want to mention in this context the work of the Medical Mediation Foundation, which has done a large amount of training medical staff precisely in conflict resolution skills. Making independent advocates and support such as legal aid available to parents in these disputes, and also for providers to provide the parents with appropriately trained communicators to improve their support to professionals, and generally, again, improve the awareness of conflict resolution techniques. And there is also a recommendation that there should be further research on the access to and effectiveness of mediation, as well as other mechanisms such as getting second opinions and referrals to ethics committees. So what's happened, what's been happening, and what are the tools that are available at the moment? So the first thing that sort of seems to have come to everybody's mind is, well, let's get mediation baked into the process so that it becomes mandatory. In the Charlie Gard case, Mr. Justice Francis said at the final hearing that it was his clear view that mediation should be attempted in all cases such as this, even if all it does is achieve a greater understanding by the parties of each other's positions. And he went on to make the obvious observation that few users of the court system will be in a greater state of turmoil and grief than parents in the position that the parents of Charlie Gard found themselves in. And he's recommending anything which helps them to understand the process and the viewpoint of the other side. Following the Charlie Gard case, there was an unsuccessful attempt to pass what was referred to as Charlie's Law. And this was a private member's bill put forward in 2020. Called the Children's Medical Treatment Dispute Resolution Bill. And that had a number of aspects to it, including increasing the weight to be given to parents' views, but also requiring mediation in the case of a dispute. Baroness Findlay, palliative care specialist and also the former chair of the National Mental Capacity Forum, put forward an amendment to the Health and Social Care Act, again, a specific clause on dispute resolution in paediatric cases, which would have put a duty on health authorities to take all reasonable steps to allow for a mediation process. And again, that wasn't accepted. But what did come into the Health and Social Care Bill was a requirement for the Secretary of State to arrange for the carrying out of a review into the causes of disputes between, on the one hand, those with parental responsibility for critically ill children, and on the others, those responsible for the provision of care or medical treatment. So that's as far as we've got in terms of proposals for kind of increasing mediation. But I also want to finish by talking about how we find out whether this is actually working or not, and therefore putting us in a better position to explain why mediation is a good option in these kinds of cases. And I'd like to just mention a research project that is taking place at the moment called Mediation of Medical Treatment Disputes, a Therapeutic Justice Model. And I've got the website address up on the slide for anyone to look up later on. It's a research project being led by the University of Essex, and I'm very pleased to be one of the advisory board to the project. And what it is proposing to do is to undertake a qualitative analysis of mediation in medical cases. Importantly, this will cover medical cases involving children, but also adults who lack capacity, and ask some questions. Are there therapeutic benefits of mediation? Or does it simply end up reflecting the same power imbalance that families can feel when they're in the grips of the dispute? Is there anything about the healthcare environment which either makes it particularly amenable to mediation, or does it make it more difficult? And in particular, what can we learn about when and how to mediate in these kind of cases? And the project is in the process of obtaining ethical approval at the moment. And I'd like to end by asking all of those of you who do become involved in mediations to consider, in this field, to consider contacting the project and volunteering to have either share your experiences or ideally have the members of the project observe mediations in appropriate cases, because it seems to me that this is going to be extremely helpful in allowing us to recommend mediation with confidence in these very difficult and distressing cases. Thank you all very much.
That's fine. Hello everyone, my name's Amelia Nice and I'm also a barrister and mediator here in Chambers. I'm going to be talking about making mediation mandatory, and we thought it'd be useful to touch on this issue at a point when the government has proposed introducing it more widely. It announced in July a consultation regarding the expansion of the small claims mediation service to all claims of £10,000 or less. And they're also consulting on making mediation compulsory in other areas, such as the Sen Tribunal. And more widely, there's growing commentary that after some years of incentives and carrots and sticks, that maybe the time has come for a real push and an introduction of mediation in a more compulsory or mandatory sense. So what I've tried to do is synthesise the key issues arising from the literature on this, starting with the tricky issues that the debate will give rise to, and then looking at some of the tools that there may be to address those issues. But first of all, looking at what's to be gained, the benefits of mediation, probably old news, and that's the first part of the slides, and I won't go over that. But in terms of making it mandatory, what might that achieve? Well, take-up would necessarily be greater to some degree. Parties would not be able to argue about whether to mediate because they would have to take that step. Mandatory mediation would also overcome the perception by lawyers that they may be seen to be weak if they advise parties to mediate because they'll have to give that advice. Conversely, any suggestion that lawyers would be able to block parties attempting mediation would also be prevented, which they might do, or arguably they do, for their own gain. And lastly, the point that's often made is that even reluctant parties warm up, and the analogy used throughout the literature is that you can take a horse to water and some of them will drink. And on the slide, you've got an emoji of a horse, but it's not very big, so I'm not sure if you can see it. Tricky questions then. That the first objection is often referred to as the mediator's objection, which is that the voluntary nature of mediation is the hallmark of its success and of producing agreements which are sustainable. And so in that context, can people really be made to mediate? And in the poll we conducted before this seminar, 70% of people were of the view that it's important for people to enter mediation voluntarily or they won't engage. The second issues there are known perhaps more as the lawyer's objections, and those are
children at home and try and get them out of hospitals so they have the care at home. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. What cancer is that going to? It's going to Tenebus Cancer Care, the Welsh charity that does wonderful work for people.
Well, hopefully we find out what wonderful work it's doing, but perhaps later on. So the second objection on the slide is access to justice and rule of law, and that's often known as the lawyer's objection. The first point is that cases may be required, rule of law is that cases may be required to go to court. There may be a need for a new legal point to be decided, and if mandatory mediation blocks that, then that's fettering that process. But there are also worries that if there's an expansion of the mediation process, that government departments or other big respondents can hide behind the confidentiality of the process and keep ongoing issues and problems secret. Access to justice relates to the fact that mediation as a mandatory process will bring in a constraint, and arguably that gives rise to a breach of Article 6 and the right to fair trial, which should involve an unconstrained access to a court. Issues of good faith. If people are forced to mediate, will they do that in good faith? If they do it in bad faith, what does that look like? Might they be willing to mediate just to force the other side to spend money on the process? Will they be using the process to try and gain disclosure, which they'll then use in litigation? And if bad faith is an issue, how is it monitored? Will mediators be asked to report back to a court or another body on the conduct of the parties? And if so, isn't that a breach of the confidentiality that is so important to the process? Then last of all, costs and public confidence. Costs is obviously who's going to pay for it. Litigants in person, are they going to be expected to pay for it themselves? And public confidence, the view seems to be that the public is still relatively unsure about what mediation is. And so how is that going to be addressed if the government wants to roll it out more widely? So I've grouped together 3 sets of tools. Oh, hold on, where's the clicker? Yep. And the first one is around language and concepts. The first is language, and there are 2 points here. One is time perhaps to stop referring to mediation as alternative. And you have the quote on the slide there from Sir Geoffrey Voss, who says it's time to start viewing it as an integral part of the dispute resolution process. I might also say that perhaps we can lose the word mandatory or lose it as soon as possible, because it's quite coercive. And in fact, there's plenty of aspects of civil and criminal justice which are mandatory, but we don't use the term. So we don't talk about mandatory witness statements or mandatory grounds. They're just one of the rules that we have to comply with. The second issue is that really the concepts, the big beasts, in terms of the voluntary nature of mediation and rule of law. As I've just said, the mediation community has always argued that the voluntary nature of mediation is central to the success of the process, and that a party's right to self-determination should be respected. But a read of the literature brings up three key issues. One is that mandatory mediation wouldn't remove the party's right to decide if they want to settle or what the settlement would look like. It merely asks them to have a go. And so that on that basis, the central features of the voluntary nature of mediation are preserved. The second issue is that although the voluntary nature of mediation is very important in some contexts, it can also be overplayed. Parties often come to a mediation exhausted, worried. They've had some pretty cold legal advice about costs, the prospects of success, the time to litigation. So although it's voluntary because it's not mandatory. And actually they know why they're there. And it's not the voluntariness that makes the process work, it's the process itself. And the last point is that there are already elements of compulsion in the system. So for example, there's an obligation to consider attending a MIAM, a mediation information assessment meeting in family disputes, or in road traffic cases, the small claims protocol requires insurers to make a settlement offer. And there are other examples. But there's no research that I know of anyway, or that's come out in the literature to show that the settlement rate is lower in those contexts. The third conceptual issue then it relates to access to justice and the rule of law. In the summer, the Civil Justice Council published a paper reviewing the access to justice issue. They've looked at the cases, domestic and ECHR cases, and they conclude that provided the parties retain the right to proceed to court at all stages, participation in dispute resolution can be compulsory without there being a breach of Article 6, and that there isn't time to go into the whys and wherefores of that now, but the paper's there. The development of the rule of law is perhaps a trickier point if the anticipation is that mediation is rolled out more broadly. But the counterpoint to the worries about constraining the courts is that if these small cases and the iterative cases are moved into a dispute resolution process, then that will free up the courts to be able to have more time and energy to deal with more complex points of law. And the last issue on the slide there is sanctions. Clearly that's going to be a huge part of the conversation, and the government in their consultation asked questions around whether conduct in a mediation can be monitored and what would be appropriate sanctions. For example, could cases be struck out for non-compliance with the rule and others? So moving on to the next slide, please. Funding and information. The first point, as I've touched on earlier, is at the moment the perception is that the supply of mediators exceeds demand, but the market's unregulated and it's quite difficult to navigate for litigants in person. So as a potential user, it's hard to know where you would go for and who would be best suited for the dispute that you're dealing with. So litigants, and especially litigants in person, need a reliable, perhaps centralised source of better information. And the second and related point is that it has to be paid for without there being a disproportionate cost on, in particular, litigants in person. Under the government proposal at the moment, the parties to a small claim who want to go to a mediation will have a free 1-hour mediation with a mediator from the HMCTS service. The second point there is the importance of pilots and consultations. Clearly, the MOJ proposal will provide very valuable information, and the slide has a map or a flow chart of the proposal. So claim is lodged, then there's defence, then a directions questionnaire, which may or may not consider whether the case should be exempt, because the government's asking questions around whether there should, in principle, be a role for exemptions. Automatic referral, so automatic referral to mediation if there are no exemptions, and then the case is paused for 28 days to allow that to happen. The parties will then have a discussion with the mediator about what the mediation will involve, and then later on a mediation. And then if it settles, that's the end of it. And if it doesn't, then they can go back to litigation. And in the middle, there are options for sanctions for non-compliance. The broader point, I've also put technology on the slide because as a result of the pandemic, many mediations moved online, as far as we understand, with no discernible drop in settlement. So that will obviously be an important tool potentially. And the last point there on the slide is that there are plenty of other jurisdictions that have for some time used compulsory mediation in various contexts, and obviously they will provide a valuable source of information. The CJC paper looks at the countries referred to on the slide and the way that they've introduced it in different areas or jurisdictions. Last slide then is in relation to public confidence and the protection of disputants. There's a clear drive, I would say, to consider increased regulation and oversight of the mediation industry, concerns that it's unregulated and that greater uniformity of standards are required, and a complaints mechanism. So the government seems to be looking at a more robust system of training, such as benchmarking training providers, or a chartered status for mediators and a system of redress. And the Civil Mediation Council is mooted as a possible regulator because it already has a decent and well-respected complaint system and so on. There's also some really interesting conversations around increasing the type of, or amplifying the training given to mediators, particularly if they're going to be dealing with vulnerable litigants in person. There's some really interesting conversations around trauma-informed mediation and mediating with very vulnerable parties, and or the use of screening questions by a mediator at a pre-meeting or at the start of the mediation itself. That leads to the conclusion, which is that it's possible or indeed probable that the foreseen small proposals at this stage may give way to an intention to move the whole system to a default system of dispute resolution. That was first, I think, mooted, I don't know if it was first mooted, but certainly it was mooted by Baroness Scotland when she was Attorney General, and she discussed the government's then aspiration of moving from ADR to mainstream dispute resolution system. And I've also included on the slide a quote from a speech given in October by the President of the Family Division, who discussed, or rather wanted to urge family lawyers to encourage their clients to opt for mediation or other forms of dispute resolution, and that they should see the family court as a last resort, not the first port of call. And then the last quote on the slide there is from an article inspired by the book Nudge, which some of you may be familiar with, which is a book about decision-making and how our cognitive biases can get in the way. And the conclusion of the article is that if we want to move to a default system of dispute resolution, that's going to require a wholesale change in the architecture around justice and so on. The end.
So, hello everybody, my name's Louisa Weinstein. I'm a mediator at Doughty Street Chambers and an associate tenant. So, moving into the workplace and employment arena, and pulling hopefully on what some of the fascinating things that we've already heard so far. I'm going to look at what we already know. Then, I'm going to firstly look at the context, and we've had some of that already, but I'm just going to deepen it for the workplace. Then we're going to look at what we know, and then the tools for tricky times. So let's see how this works. Okay, so conflict at work is extremely prevalent, close to 10. So there was an ACAS report that came out in 2021, so right in the middle of the pandemic, based on some very in-depth research. It was actually the first time that we really started, everyone felt like, well, there's conflict in the workplace and it's affecting people and it needs to be resolved earlier. But this research was really in-depth. And you know, the fact that close to 10 million people experience conflict at work each year, that was then. But more importantly, the effect on mental health, so stress, anxiety, depression. And obviously that hasn't been updated post COVID, but there has been, I think, universally acknowledged that the challenges with mental health did increase over that period, and definitely impacting the conflicts that people are having. It's expensive. So cost of conflict is, in the UK to business, 28.5 billion. That's equivalent to £1,000 per employee per year, not insignificant. Very interesting also, a CIPD study talking about the fact that just over a third of respondents to that study, and it was a significant amount of people, experience conflict, whether that's isolated disputes or incidents of conflict or ongoing difficult relationships. As well as that, we know that the employment tribunals have been heaving, particularly with a kind of 3-month suspension, which means that as matters proceed to tribunal, the individuals that are involved in them are undergoing huge amounts of stress, worries about their future careers, and the impact on the organisations is also significant, because the reputational damage, the ripple effect within the organisation on other employees is significant. Oops, no, back. There we go. Right, so we've discussed the fact that compulsory mediation for small civil claims is on its way for under 10,000, and that compulsory mediation is also set to be in place for family mediation in all but the most serious of cases. We also know that we have in place systems to resolve conflict earlier. So we've got ACAS, and that's used a lot. Early conciliation, which is different to mediation, but it's alternative dispute resolution, is used a lot. And when it's used, matters often don't escalate. Well, more often than not, 65% of early conciliation notifications didn't proceed to employment tribunal, and at least 77% of employment tribunal cases received by ACAS in a period April to March 2021 didn't go on to hearing. So when there is an intervention, an early dispute resolution, it often works. As mediators, we also experience that, I'd say in 90% of cases, even more of workplace and employment mediations, the matter is resolved. So we've talked a little, Amelia talked very eloquently about why, whether that doesn't happen more often, maybe if push. So thinking a little bit about mediation as we go into the disciplinary and grievance process. I sometimes look at the disciplinary and grievance process like a conflict escalator. Once we get on it, it's quite hard to get off it unless you kind of jump, in which case, there can be a lot of collateral damage. As we go through the grievance and disciplinary process, as we go up that escalator, the parties themselves move further and further away from each other. So the potential for a decent conversation, particularly because we're talking about careers, ongoing relationships, reputation damage, and many of the things that Alfie was talking about at the beginning, if not all, are very, very important. So we have a system that we enter into to resolve conflict that escalates the conflict. And so what do we do? The other key factor is that failure to raise a grievance can lead, if there's a tribunal claim, to a reduction in the compensation. So if I don't raise a grievance, or if I don't advise my client to raise a grievance, the risk is that they may lose out on compensation. So what do we do? There's talk. So I'm a member of the Civil Mediation Workplace Committee, and constantly pushing the question of could there be a change in the ACAS code? Well, any change in the ACAS code, I would imagine, would be quite unlikely, particularly today. Rishi Sunak has proposed that there be legislation in place to reduce strike action. So the trust, the people that need to agree to if there's a change in the ACAS code for to introduce earlier resolution, then all sorts of other things get thrown in as well at the same time, because the ACAS code doesn't get changed that often. So the appetite for a change in the ACAS code is unlikely to be great, just on the basis of trust. So realistically, there may not be any kind of change like that until possibly a change of government, probably at this stage. And what would it say? So many mediators or specialists in early resolution talk about, and I talk about it quite a bit, is taking away the grievance and disciplinary process and replacing it with an early resolution scheme. Now, obviously, you would never take away the grievance and disciplinary process, but if you change the language, you change the psychological contract between the employer and the employee. We enter into the grievance and disciplinary process. What's going to happen? We're going to be either aggrieved or we're going to be disciplined. We're either going to be upset or we're going to be told off. If we enter into an early resolution scheme or an early resolution process or framework's a good word, I think, we are thinking about early resolution. We're preparing for early resolution, which means we're already more empowered. We're already taking more responsibility actually in the resolution of these issues, because the power dynamic is not always simple. So again, how do we as or how do lawyers in particular support that process? I think there's the key in the Employment Rights Act around unless they have a good reason not to raise a grievance. So what's a good reason not to raise a grievance? You'd raise something else. You might raise a formal concern. And I think there's something in the possibility of maybe the ACAS guidance that can move people in that way, but actually it's about looking at what we've got in place already and seeing what we can put in place for clients and organizations to enable that earlier resolution. What's also very interesting in the ACAS report is how essential conflict competence is in an organization and good management. And of course, most of you, if not all of you, are going to be giving legal advice, but actually some of the good legal advice is going to be ensure that your people have better conflict competence. And that's quite a big deal, because it's understanding, it's an emotional intelligence, and it's a set of frameworks and capacity to negotiate. But it's worth bearing in mind. So tools, early resolution scheme or early resolution framework, what does that look like? So it could look like putting in place an early resolution policy with the aims of providing individuals with alternative, impartial, non-judgmental framework to address and resolve conflicts to the satisfaction of all involved. What it's doing when you're introducing that kind of framework is you're putting out an intention. You're already starting the conversation between the employer and the employee about, actually, before the conflict's even happened, let's look at how we want to resolve it and what values are important to us. And it's not a plug, but in my book, The 7 Principles of Conflict Resolution, there are a few frameworks in there that look at how you might do that. But there are many ways to introduce those kind of alternatives. And then looking at contractual provisions for employment and workplace disputes. But and also the thought about raising or preempting grievance and disciplinaries through raising of a concern, maybe an informal concern, a formal concern, and how you might do that. as long as it's a good reason, as long as you're creating a good reason not to create a grievance. Conflict competence is obviously really important, and also you've obviously got the opportunities of internal and external mediators, but also just having within the organisation, resolution agents, people that are going to have the capacity, that aren't necessarily just in HR. In fact, sometimes it's good that they're not in HR, to move the conflict along and increasing that capacity for managers. So I think to conclude, I'd say that times, the pressure, the stress, the clear kind of escalation in mental health, also the increase in disciplinary in discrimination claims. People are upset about a lot of things and need to work them through. And even though we've got ACAS, we've got judicial mediation, we've got lots of things in place, it needs to be better. It can be better. So I'd be interested to know how you want to respond, and maybe we can address that later on, how you feel and think that you can respond in those circumstances to the way that we work and engage with each other. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lawrence Kirshen. I'm a mediator, and I was a barrister until about 20 years ago. I'm now a has-been barrister. Perhaps that's the right phrase. Can you hear me okay? Good. I asked that once at a presentation, and so a voice from the back said, yes, but I'm willing to change places with someone who can't. So I hope you're with me. Look, there's a million things to talk about in the context of environmental mediation, and I've got about 15 minutes, so I'm going to skim over the surface. But the first thing that I want to say is just to take a minute to look at where we've got to over these past few years, because I'm going to suggest that conflict seems to arise more quickly and people are more passionate about it than ever before. People seem to form opinions as quickly and as passionately as they do their support for their favorite football team. And it becomes a kind of a difficulty in mediation that people are indeed very entrenched and very quickly. So conflict is, of course, an inevitable part of our lives. It's a natural result of human differences, but violence is not. And when we deal with conflict in an adversarial way, it generates polarization and violence. And when we collaborate to resolve our differences, conflict can catalyze positive change, as I think Althea said at the very beginning of this presentation. And in recent years, conflict seems to have been ramped up, or maybe dumbed down is a better phrase, by unique factors. There's the trauma of the worldwide pandemic that we don't have to dwell on now, but the restrictions of our freedoms of movement and speech have clearly been a fallout from that. We've got a war in our time and on our doorsteps. We have economic chaos and an erosion of trust in politics and politicians. You may not agree, you may have deep trust in them, so forgive me for making a controversial comment like that. And then there's the mixed blessing of social media, which of course has created a more connected world, but with its sound bites and echo chambers and the anonymity of what people can say on social media, it's given free rein to hate speech, discrimination, and a great deal more conflict. And the greatest conflict of all, I suggest, you may have a different view, but I can't see anything more important than the climate and environment conflict, the crisis that we face, that we are deep into now. There seems to be no doubt anymore that the connection between our industrialized world and the conflict, the environmental crisis, is established beyond reasonable doubt. I hope There's very few people now who still argue it. But at the heart of it is the fact that we earthlings have a need for energy, and at the same time, we have a need for a harmonious and a healthy and a happy life living in the natural world. So you, all of us have mixed feelings about this. We depend on energy for everything that happens around us, and yet we want to preserve and protect our planet. So that's could be said to be our internal conflict as a civilization. But of course, there is a clash between these different needs out in the world. So these are indeed tricky times, and perhaps I need say no more about it. But how can we address these clashes, these conflicts of which others have spoken so well, and of which the environmental issue crisis is the greatest? And the answer, predictably, is mediation. And I know it's an extravagant claim to say that it can change the world, but the evidence that I'm going to turn to suggests that it can. It is a way to resolve these conflicting needs that we have. There's a ton of evidence, and I have little time, but I want to say to you that people have been mediating and using similar processes in environmental crises, in environmental conflicts. They are doing it at this moment. We are doing it at this moment, because although I'm a commercial mediator, I work as a commercial mediator, I have found myself more and more being drawn into the environmental world. And the examples that keep coming up, one that I was involved in was a simple case of harm to land, where a purchaser of land that included a former filling station discovered that the land was contaminated by hydrocarbons and sued the previous owner, who was an oil company, for breach of contract. And then there was a chain of previous owners who were joined in the litigation. And a long story short, they arrived at a resolution which, as well as financial compensation, had within it an undertaking to restore the land to a healthy condition. There's the air, a recent case, not mine, of hydrogen sulfide emissions from a landfill site. The local council issued an abatement notice. The site owners appealed. The case was set down for a 4-week trial, and in 2 days there was a mediated agreement, with agreement not merely on how the site could be managed in the future, but also with financial compensation. I should put it the other way around. There was financial compensation, but there was also an agreement about how the site could be managed in the future, which you will know, if you're familiar with mediation, is once again an example of what mediation can offer that the court and the court's judgment couldn't possibly offer. And then there's the sea, and this is harm to the sea. The Brent Spar, does anyone remember the Brent Spar in 1995, when Shell proposed to sink in the North Sea a redundant oil platform? And when we say an oil platform, I don't know if you've ever seen one of these things, it is massive. So it's like a small town. That the proposal was that the oil company would sink it in the ocean. And thank God there was an energetic media campaign. There was a poll of the British public that showed that the majority were opposed to it. There were boycotts, and to cut a long story short, again, there was a mediation when Shell withdrew their plan, and in fact later had the Brent Spar dismantled, and it was upcycled as housing for the Stavanger Port Authority. That's perhaps going a little too much detail, but so that's mediation. It's happening all the time in environmental issues. But I want to open out the picture just a little bit to suggest that mediation, the formal idea of mediation, I don't know, how many of you are mediators? Can I ask, or have trained as mediators? Great. Well, then you will know that there's a formal process. Of course, it's hopefully informal when you do it, but there is a mediation process. But I want to suggest that there are a number of different paths to resolution by dialogue, which could be said to be facilitated dialogue dispute resolution. And they include things like stakeholder dialogues. They include things like victim-offender mediation in the criminal world. They include what is broadly called restorative justice, although I'll come to that in a minute, which is similar to victim-offender mediation. Is anyone familiar with restorative justice? Great, okay. So you'll know that it's used typically in a case where there's a victim and an offender, but there's a much larger group than just a victim-offender mediation. And I could wax lyrical about the benefits of restorative justice, but I'd better stick to its relevance to the environment. So the definition of restorative justice, one anyway, is that it's a process where all the stakeholders affected by an injustice have an opportunity to discuss how they've been affected by it and to decide what should be done to repair the harm, which is a very explicit aim. And the classic example is one that took place in New South Wales in Australia in 2006, where the owner of a mining company who had carried out some mining activities, or the mining company had carried out those activities which caused damage to a designated Aboriginal place and destroying Aboriginal objects. There was an there was a restorative justice process. Forgive me, I may slip into RJ from time to time, you know what I mean, I hope. And as a result of it, and this I found fascinating, was that the director of the company and his family and representatives of the indigenous people and their families and state government departments were all represented in this process. So it was much bigger than just a mediation. And what came out of it was, first of all, that there was financial compensation, but secondly, that there was ongoing contact between the mine owner and the local people who were affected, the Wilyakali people. And there was to be consultation before further works were undertaken. There was an agreement to foster Indigenous employment opportunities at the mine, and the judge explicitly found that there was evidence of genuine contrition and remorse on the part of the mining company director. So there was a classic example in 2006 of how mediation, and in this case a restorative justice process, could be used within the framework of a court case to bring together parties, to have the dialogue that we've been talking about over the last hour or so. So some more examples, and then I'll come to two that really are the up-to-date, ongoing issues with which I'm concerned that maybe illustrate some of the points that I'm making, because there are challenges to the implementation of restorative processes, mediation and restorative processes in the environment. The first is to get the parties to the table, encouraging parties to engage, the very question that Althea has already addressed. In restorative justice, as you will know, those of you familiar with it, that it's pretty much essential that the defendant, so-called, has accepted guilt, or at the very least responsibility for what he or possibly she has done. Well, that's a pretty big ask if you're asking the director of a company to engage in a restorative justice process. And the question is, what would bring such people to the table? And I suggest one answer, at least, is litigation. And I'm sorry, because we're all here shouting the benefits of mediation, but I think that just like mediation takes place in the shadow of the law, as we sometimes say, so mediation and environmental mediation and restorative process take place in the shadow of a growing body of legislation and litigation, both civil and criminal. And it is those factors, I believe, that are increasingly working on corporates, because it's usually corporates that we're talking about, to get them to engage in dialogue in resolving this clash of needs. And there is climate change litigation taking place as a tool to strengthen climate action. In something like 2,000 cases have now been brought in multiple jurisdictions around the world, as well as in the European Court of Justice. So there is a huge growing body of approaches to compelling a compliance with what you might call environmental issues, but also giving the possibility of a dialogue within those cases, whether civil or criminal. There's the Crime and Courts Act in this country, 2013, which gives the court power to defer any trial of an adult for a restorative justice process to take place. That is a much forgotten yet valuable piece of legislation that could, in many cases, justify bringing, first of all, a prosecution, secondly, for example, the Environment Agency, and secondly, to pause it for a dialogue, a restorative dialogue to take place. There's the International Criminal Court, which announced a few years back that it was going to include environmental crimes in its remit. There is the law, the International Crime of Ecocide, which some of you may be familiar with, which is growing in support, where the definition is unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe or widespread or long-term damage to the environment caused by those acts. And of course, simply speaking, ecocide means killing one's home. And that is a law which is being considered by more than 25 countries, as well as the European Parliament and a whole bunch of other senior figures, which I'm not going to spell out, but even lawyers are involved in supporting the idea of a law of ecocide. So, what would bring parties to the table? Well, being subject to legal proceedings and having the opportunity to have a dialogue within them is clearly one stick that might encourage them to engage with mediation and RJ. There's also the carrot of the business case, which I'll come to in a moment. There's also the name, which I find unhelpful to call it restorative justice, because as one commentator said, if you call it justice, it's very quickly associated in the business world with, as he said, court, tribunal, lawyer, penalty, and sentence. So clearly asking people to engage voluntarily in a process which is going to be justice, and they are on the receiving end of it, is not very attractive. So I think it's really important to have flexibility about what you call the process, although the principle at the heart of it is the same. And I was involved in one where a local council was holding an airfair, the largest airfair in Britain, as a matter of fact, Air Festival they called it. And the local community were up in arms. The residents and indeed environmental groups were opposed to it because of the damage from pollution, traffic, noise, etc. And eventually what happened was there was a kind of a stakeholder dialogue, but it was essentially a restorative process to find ways to meet the needs of the different interests. We called it a symposium. And what a symposium is, I never quite bottomed out, but I know what it was in practice, which was it was a mediation. But I think calling it a symposium helped. And the third challenge is, who are the victims in an environmental conflict? Well, obviously, there's the landowners or whoever it is who own the resource that's the subject of the harm. There's the surrounding community. There's the local authority, the government maybe, who have all had responsibility for bringing this into being. And there is, of course, the non-human world. And the question is whether we can shift from our anthropocentric view of our position in the natural world, namely we're at the peak of it, and others are, natural elements are there as a resource for us. Well, it may be that that is no longer a viable paradigm to work from. And the question is how, in a mediation, could you have representatives of what you might call the natural world? For example, and I'll give you two examples that have actually taken place. In 2017, a New Zealand court granted the Wanganui River the status of a living entity. It was in a dispute, there was a dispute around the river and pollution of the river, and the court ordered that two guardians be appointed to act on behalf of the river, one from the Crown and the other from the Wanganui indigenous people. And in the same month, March 2017, in India, the North Indian Uttarakhand court ruled that both the Ganges and the Yamuna rivers, should be accorded the status of living human entities. And a management board they ordered should be set up with 3 officials as legal guardians to conserve and protect the rivers. So already you're beginning to see that the courts are, admittedly in other countries, other jurisdictions, are starting to recognize that natural world is not necessarily without a voice, that it is appropriate and indeed, I would say, essential that those elements are represented. So let me come to the last 2 things that I want to say, which are 2 cases I've been recently involved in. One is in the Balkans, the beastly Balkans, as it's been said. They're also home to the last free-flowing rivers in Europe. But what's happened is that thousands of small hydroelectric dams have been erected, some of them illegally in national parks and so on, preventing the flow of water. It isn't just preventing the flow of water, but there is huge impact, say the local communities, on ecosystems, water sources, animal populations. There are secondary impacts from construction, from waste, from water abstraction. In other words, the river systems are being destroyed in the Balkans. And the challenge is, how do we get the relevant parties to the table? Because government is not very interested in joining this discussion. Local government is reluctant, and we have been having, I'm working with a person in the Balkans, are having a struggle to get those parties to the table, without which no mediation, no restorative process is ever going to take place. However, there is one river system where the local community and the local government are both concerned about the damage to the environment, and there is very strong academic support for a process of mediated resolution. So there is, at the moment, no more than a prospect, but I would say a good prospect, that a restorative circle may be agreed. And lastly this, the oil company case. As you all know, oil extraction in Africa has been taking place for decades, probably 50 years, caused significant environmental, social, and economic damage. People have lost their livelihoods, people have lost their lives in some cases. And there is conflict and litigation between the communities, some communities, and the oil companies concerned. Last year in February, I was asked to facilitate a dialogue between communities in one particular region in Africa and the oil company in question. We call it Oilco. And it was described as a restorative process, not restorative justice. And one of the first questions that came up was, and this was a learning point for me and maybe for you as well, which is if Oilco was going to engage, it wanted to know what's the business case, which when you think about it from the point of view of the corporate is an entirely appropriate question. They're there to make money, they're there to do business. And so they wanted to know what is the business case? So I spent some time with them working through what the business case might be, and in due course they agreed to participate. We have had several online sessions, so it was all virtual. There was never a time when we met. And it finished in October, so a couple of months ago this year. And it's ended with a project being set up for the provision of off-grid renewable energy networks in some of the areas affected. For short, solar mini-grids. In other words, sustainable, clean energy for areas that had been not merely deprived of reliable energy, but actually have been relying on what they call artisanal refineries, meaning small refineries that criminal gangs had set up, causing huge pollution. So these solar mini-grids have emerged from this restorative process. And not only do they solve a question of clean, reliable and low-cost energy, sustainable energy, but they also create productive use initiatives. So business ventures are now more secure. They can rely on a continuing supply of energy. And if they have a continuing supply of energy, they can build a business, a chicken processing place that relies on refrigeration, knows that it will have refrigeration. And that in turn creates other business opportunities for the local community. So it starts to rejuvenate the area, and there is an expectation that by or around the end of this year, the first solar PV photovoltaic systems will be set up and operational. So I've probably gone over time, forgive me, but I say, for those of you who know mediation, it's a no-brainer. For those of you who are not familiar with mediation, maybe it's not so obvious, but I would say, in the context of the environmental crisis that we face, what's not to love about a mediated restorative process? And I would strongly, well, I would first of all invite you to ask questions and challenges if we've still got time. I guess we need a bit more time. But also, I would strongly encourage you to look for any opportunity in the environmental world that you might be connected with, to see if there's a way in which you can instigate some form of mediation or restorative process that will enable us to, not to put too big fine a point on it, save the planet. Why not? Thank you very much.